So we're up to a interesting topic today.
It is. It sounds interesting.
Sounds
And
interesting.
it's scaring at the same time.
Huh?
It's scary.
Oh, this one's actually quite straightforward. If you've used Active Directory, it's not too much big deal difference. Okay, so sorry. Before we get started, let's have a look at it's week 6. So term 1's nearly finished. So let's quickly have a look at where we should be at, because I know it's a semester-long subject, one lesson a week. So sometimes we can lose track of where we should be at. So let's quickly have a look, so we're all on the same page. So we're not under any different opinion of where we should be at. Okay, so that's what's going on. No, sorry, I've got something else open here. Must have restored from last time. All right, so what we've got is the schedule, and that's what we go by, okay? So you probably know from your other subjects and stuff like that, what we have in the schedule is some due dates. Perfect timing, Robin. We're just getting started. All right, so we're just talking about the study schedule. So just because we're getting close to the end of term 1, I know you've got some term subjects you've got to do a lot of work for, and that's fair enough. But just so we know where we're at, we're sort of looking at securing VMware vSphere today. We're going to look at creating and managing virtual machines next week, and then we're going to look at using templates and VApps. Then we have 3 weeks break. That's a really, really good time for you to catch up if you're not on top of everything. Then there's a couple of more topics on vSphere. Then we start moving on to Hyper-V. Okay, but if you notice that we should already be starting our assignment 1, which is the practical assignment. And when we come back, probably halfway through next term, we'll have that build virtualization infrastructure practical for final sign-off. Okay, so what does it mean? If you look at the assignment, you're supposed to be getting me to check things as you go along. Okay, so securing VMware vSphere. Okay, what's that all about? So in Cert 4, you would have learned about how we can give rights or permissions to file systems. But you also would have learned that that's not the only thing we can give permissions to or rights to. Pretty much everything you can give rights to. Okay, in Cisco, you would have learned about access control list. That's permissions or rights to be able to communicate what is allowed, what's not allowed, what's the source, what's the destination, and what's the protocol, for example. Okay, in Active Directory, like I use administrator, that means I can create users in Active Directory. That's because as administrator, I've got the permissions. But if you guys are part of my team and you're, let's say, level 2, or not level 1, level 2, okay? Help desk, desktop support. And what you have to do is sometimes reset people's passwords. Sometimes you need to add people to members of groups. But I don't really want you to control anything else beyond that. I can also set permissions in Active Directory and delegate what permissions you have to be able to do in Active Directory. If you remember that in Cert 4, we said that we can delegate permissions to different areas of Active Directory. I can make you the administrator for this OU and everything below it, but everything above it, inside of it, you have no control. So we can set permissions there. We can even set permissions in DNS, who can view it, who can change it. So permissions and rights are everywhere. Okay? Do you agree with that? Everywhere. It doesn't matter what system you go onto. It doesn't matter if it's a file system, it's a service, you have permissions or rights you can set. And that's the same with vSphere. Okay? What we're going to learn today is how we can actually take the Active Directory users and groups and then give them permissions in vSphere. Okay? So that's what we're going to learn. Configuring and controlling. So today's objective is to configure and control authentication to vSphere. So first of all, we've got to, you know how we've been logging in as administrator at vSphere.local? That's obviously the local administrator to vSphere only. That administrator doesn't exist anywhere else. But what we're going to do today is we're going to connect our vSphere to our Active Directory, and then we're going to use the administrator account from Active Directory to log in and control vSphere, first of all. Second of all, then we're going to take users, such as we'll create users for you, each of you guys in our own setup, and then we're going to give you yourself permission to do certain things like administrative permissions. And then we're going to give other users different levels of access, and we'll see how fine-grained it is. We can see how fine-grained we can control. So we can actually just let a user mount and unmount a ISO to a virtual machine, and that's all they can do. That's how fine-grained you can get it. The main thing is you have to understand who's the person, or who's the group of the person, what they need to do with these VMs. Because don't forget, we're not controlling what they can do inside the VMs, we're controlling what they can do to the VMs. Because if you have a web server, a Windows Server 2019 web server, you still can remote desktop to it, still can log in as administrator, and once you log in administrator, you can do whatever you like inside the operating system, isn't it? Inside the Windows Server operating system. vSphere has no control of that. Okay, that's not what we're talking about today. What we're talking about is what these users can do to the virtual machine. You're looking at it from the outside, not from the inside where the operating system is. That's controlled by the Microsoft operating system, if it's a Microsoft one. So when we say from the outside, that means the virtual hardware, whether you turn it on or turn it off, whether you change networks, whether you reconfigure it or move the location of the virtual machine. That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about can they configure the web server to use port 85 instead of 80. That's inside the operating system, isn't it? So we're going to manage roles and access controls. We're going to control network access to services on ESXi hosts, and we're going to integrate it with Active Directory. So a lot of words on this slide, isn't it? So securing vSphere environments means securing all the different components of the vSphere. Okay, there's the ESXi host, the vCenter, the VMs, specifically the guest operating systems running inside the VM. So when we're talking about security, it's holistic. It's not just one thing and not the other things. So I'm sure you've learned now, security, this is what I like to say. I'm not sure if you guys have heard me say it. Security is like Shrek. Do you remember Shrek from the movie? Do you remember the first movie, the Shrek? What did they say Shrek was like? Remember that movie? No? Okay. You guys must not have kids, or you guys must be too young to watch that movie. But they said that Shrek was like an onion. And what does an onion have? Layers. Okay, layers. Security is all about layers. Okay, this door can stop one thing, people entering physically. This door will not stop someone accessing it over the network. But if this door wasn't here, they don't need to go through the network. They just come here and just take the hard drive and do whatever they like, couldn't they? There's a lot more things you can do to the server or to the computer if you have physical access than you can do over the network. So this one layer protects against one thing. The firewall protects another thing. The antivirus protects another thing. The operating system patches protect against another thing. The intrusion detection systems protect against another thing. But when you add it all together, and this one fixes this hole, this one fixes that hole, hopefully you're addressing most things. No such thing as 100%. 100% is you take yourself offline. That's 100%, okay? There's air gap. You heard that term? You air gapped. So if you work for some military, for example, or contractors for military, you may not be able to be connected to the internet at the time when you're connecting to their services. You worked in that situation before, Reza?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, you don't have to tell them anymore. Sometimes they're not allowed to talk about that, okay? So, yeah, so I know I've got a lot of friends, electronic engineers, they work for Department of Defense, they do this and they do that. And they're telling me they obviously can't get too much detail, but it's obviously security is in the roof, yeah? Like here we're talking about normal corporations, the FE's confectionery is just a company, it makes lollies. Okay, if they get fully compromised, who cares? Not who cares, they care. Who else cares? Not really, not many people, okay? But obviously the government and Department of Defense have got more higher restrictions. All right, so when we're looking at security, we've got to look at the whole picture, everything, the applications running in the VMs, for example. Like if we're looking at a server, there's more things I can do if it's there's things I do because it's a Windows server, there's things I do with Linux server, but there's things I do if it's a web server, and there's things I do if it's an Active Directory server. It depends on every aspect of what the server is doing. When considering how to secure various components involved in vSphere environment, there are 3 different aspects of security. So you've probably heard of me talk about this on in Roman, because you've had me in class before, the 3A model. Yes, definitely, right. Authentication, proving who you are. Okay, that's number 1. If you don't have authentication, anyone can be anyone, couldn't they? So once you prove who you are, authorization is what permissions, what rights you have to things. So just because for example, just because you can log in doesn't mean you can do anything you like. You guys, for example, are students. You guys can log in, you can access the L drive, but you can't delete things off the L drive. You can read and copy stuff, but you can't delete stuff. Then thirdly, just because you're an administrator and you can do anything you like doesn't mean you should. Yeah, what if I'm an administrator and and I got a system and I've got all your information and I go, oh, Alexi, I want to know where he lives. Okay, should I go in my system and look up his address? Well, I could, because I have that power, but should I? Do you think I should? Okay, is there a reason why I need to look up Alexi? Do I need to visit him because he's sick so I can give him his homework? Well, maybe that's a good reason, okay? But if it wasn't for that reason, is there a reason why I need to find out his address? No. If there's no reason for you to do your job and to find out his address, then I shouldn't be doing it. It's unethical and it's illegal. Okay? Just because you got the powers to do it, and you're using the system or the information in a way that's not part of your job, then that's illegal. Okay? So the third thing is accounting. That's where we log, we track, we sort of audit what people are doing. So, for example, in the Certful, we set up the auditing in the file system. Everything has a log. So, for example, when you logged in today, there's a log somewhere that says you logged in at this time on this computer, and therefore, and we can backtrack it. Okay, so this is referred to the AAA security model, and basically with this model in mind, we ask people to prove who they are, give them access levels, and then track what they're doing on the different things. Yes?
I have a question.
Yeah.
For example, if you sysadmin,
yeah,
and you just check some resources,
yeah,
and there is a log. But if you sysadmin, you can delete this log or alter it.
Yeah, you definitely can. And
how does it work?
Then when they inspect the log, and they'll say this log is missing. Okay.
Or you can alter, just remove.
Yeah, you can remove entries, but then there's no entry, but there's also logs for the logs themselves. You know, auditing for the logs themselves. Okay, so there's obviously if you have control of everything and no one else is watching you, you do whatever you like. You know what I mean? But in an ideal system, there's not just one person. Okay, there's other people as well involved. And there's more than one administrator usually, and it's like you can fool other people, and sometimes you can fool everyone, but like there will be times where you can't, and then you're done, right? So yeah, so I'm not sure, I'm sure you all agree that people with access to sensitive information should only access them as part of their job. Would you agree with that? So therefore, I want you guys to be good administrators, not those bad administrators. Okay. All right, securing ESXi hosts. So the hosts themselves, we can manage in groups locally. So they already have the root user. We use that to access the ESXi directly. We can have 2 or 3 accounts all that are needed to access the ESXi host. You need to have at least 2 accounts in case one of the users is unavailable. Okay. So the root user, we've been using administrator and root all the time, haven't we? In real life, you shouldn't be using those accounts. You should be using your own specific user accounts. Obviously, it's convenient for us as students and lecturers to just use those built-in accounts, okay, instead of creating all these ones. But in reality, no one should be using those accounts. Those accounts should be disabled, really, after you've added other user accounts. Okay. Users and groups on ESXi hosts are by default managed independently. So it's a bit like peer-to-peer networking. If you have ESXi hosts, their accounts are all per ESXi host. You create a user on ESXi1, that user would not appear on ESXi2. So it's a bit like that peer-to-peer networking. You have to create the same user account again on those. So you have two ways of managing user accounts locally. You can use the command line tool, or you can use the vSphere client and create user accounts on them. You probably noticed that we're not going to focus on that too much, because why? When we got Active Directory, right? So just like we don't probably recommend doing peer-to-peer networking, we don't recommend using local accounts on ESXi, okay? VMware can also use Active Directory as a centralized security authority for ESXi hosts. ESXi host Active Directory prerequisites include that time synchronization. So I think I mentioned this before about the NTP servers, okay, network time protocol servers. But in a Active Directory situation, all the Active Directory members should synchronize their time to the domain controller, okay? Because the domain controller and the clients of the Active Directory have to be on the same time. If they drift more than, like, I don't know what exactly numbers, I think it's about 5 to 10 minutes. If they're 5 to 10 minutes off the time, then all those cryptography keys, as well as like this, when we log in, we get a session granting ticket, which means we can use that to access resources. Because the time's off, then that might not work properly. Other things, if your time is not synchronized, you get all sorts of weird errors. So it must be synchronized to the Active Directory domain controllers.
And trust will be disconnected between two domains.
Sorry?
Yeah. And trusted domains will be disconnected if you have.
Yeah, definitely. If you don't have time, right, because all the trust depends on these cryptography and sessions, okay, tickets. But if the time is off, they won't be able to trust each other. They'll lose trust. You guys might have already seen this before, a little bit. When you reset one of your computers to a snapshot, have you done that before? The domain controller or one of the servers back to a snapshot, and then when you try to log in, it says the domain and this computer has lost the trust relationship or something like that. Yeah. Seen that, right? That's because you've gone back in time. So the status of your computer is not trusted by the domain controller because the domain controller has detected that you're not at the same state. The easiest way to fix that is take it out of the domain, put it back in the domain. Okay, because then you re-establish that trust. Okay, ESXi can resolve. Yeah, also we need DNS. So you probably heard me say this definitely for the Roman and Son, no DNS, no Active Directory. Okay, if your DNS doesn't work, your Active Directory, all these services do not work because with Active Directory, there's what's called service records inside of DNS. It's like advertising. I am the LDAP server. I am this server. I am that server. And if you are needing to access those services, you don't have DNS, you can't find those services. You must create a ESX admin group in Active Directory. So you must put the accounts that should be permitted to connect to ESXi host in this group. You can't use other group names. It must be called ESX admin because it's hard coded. Okay. Do you think this is easy? It's not too hard, but is it convenient? It's not very convenient. It seems like a headache, doesn't it? Yeah. So this is for putting ESXi hosts directly with Active Directory. This has no vCenter. This situation, what we're talking about is there's no vCenter. It's only when you have individual ESXi hosts, but you still want to use Active Directory, this is what you do. Again, why? If we have a vCenter, we would not do it that way, okay? So we're just giving you options for what is possible, just like the peer-to-peer network, the local users, and then you can use Active Directory directly from the ESXi, but later on we'll talk about what we should do. We can also control local access. ESXi has a direct access user console interface. So that's what we call the DCUI. So that's what you see when you load up that sort of console. But access to this console should not be given to everyone, obviously, because they can go in and change settings, couldn't they? So access to the DCUI is limited to users who have administrator role on that ESXi. The limitations of the DCUI allows you to control who is permitted to access the DCUI. It's important to secure access to the host via physical server console. What does that mean? It means that it's like physical security. If they have access to the console directly on the computer, on the ESXi, they can do a lot of things. So having them in a locked room with a door, like in a server room or something like that, means they do not have physical access to this console. And also there's a command line environment. So command line environment allows us to remote terminal as well. By default, the command line environment is disabled, but if you need command line interface access ESXi, you must first enable the ESXi shell, and you'll see that we can do that. We'll do that today. We'll enable the SSH. You can enable the ESXi shell via the DCUI or via the vSphere client. VMware doesn't recommend that you use the ESXi shell as a primary means of managing and maintaining ESXi. Okay, obviously. Because it's a security. Anytime you open up something, you allow something remotely, it becomes a security risk. So secure shell is encrypted remote console, so that's better. ESXi includes SSH as a method of remote console, and this allows administrator to use the SSH client remotely to access the CLI of the thing. So this is a little bit different to the ESXi shell that we were talking about, because if we're talking about just the ESXi shell, okay, so however, like so the SSH is remote. Let's see, however, like the ESXi shell, SSH access to the ESXi host is disabled by default. In order to gain access to remote CLI, you must enable this service, and we'll do that. So again, they recommend against SSH. It's like the more doors you have in your house, the more ways the burglar can go in, isn't it? So that's what it's basically all about. There's also a firewall. Okay, like any server or device, it has a firewall, host firewall. It's shipped to a firewall that controls traffic. So it's a very simple firewall. It's what we call packet filtering firewall. So you heard the term packet filter before? Yes? No? So what kind of information does a packet filter firewall rules? What kind of information is it based on? Okay, so you know how I can allow access or deny access based on some things, right? Like, for example, in an application layer filtering, I can allow your traffic through by scanning the email you're sending, see if it contains viruses, and then if it doesn't, then I can let it through my firewall. That's an application layer firewall. But if it's a packet filtering, what kind of information does it use?
Protocol port.
Yeah, and well,
destination.
Yeah,
source and destination.
Yeah. So it's the information you can find in the packet.
It's like ACO.
Yeah, exactly. The ACO is a packet filtering. Okay, when we say packet filtering, there's different sorts of packet filtering, but the only information you can use in packet filtering is the information you can find in a packet header. Source, destination IP address, source, destination port. Okay, so and obviously whether it's UDP or TCP or ICMP. Okay, so all those information are found in a packet, right? Headers, you remember that from Cisco? And when we're talking about packet filtering, that's the information we can base our filtering rules on. So these are some of the things that you may or may not need to open. So managing VMs, the ESXi host, some of the default ports open are these ones. So does anyone remember what this one is?
Which one?
Sorry, wrong screen. This one?
It's
yeah, that was on HTTPS.
Yeah, HTTPS, correct. So basically that's what we've been using to interface, isn't it, for the vSphere client? And if you look at this, the 22 it says SSH, 8000 is vMotion, but you notice that some of these numbers are smaller than 1024. and some of these numbers are bigger than 1024. What's the significance of 1024? It's obviously a binary number, we all know that. But what do we call the ports below 1024? And what do we call the ports above the 1024? Or 1023, really? Any ideas? It seems like a test, isn't it? Every week I'm testing you. I'm testing you because obviously this is stuff. Well-known. Sorry, they're giving me well-known ports for ships. Well-known ports. Okay, so basically ports 0 to 1023 are what's called well-known ports, and they have a designated function. Have a specific function. You don't change that. Okay. If you want your web server to work with every other client in the whole universe, you don't change it from port 80 and port 443. If you change it to port 8080, for example, then no one in the whole world would be able to access you unless they know specifically to port 8080 on the end of the URL. Because the clients know, by default work on these ports. And that's what the first 1024 ports are. They're well-known ports. They're designated for a specific function. It's agreed upon by everyone that's using these protocols to use those ports. Oh, yeah, but above that, 1024 to 49,000 are registered ports, which are flexible. Okay, you can use it for various things. And then the remainder of the ports up to 65,535, that's also a binary number, can be used dynamically for application, which means wherever you like. Okay, but the first 1024 ports is designated specifically for purposes. Okay, let's keep on going. So here's an example. Again, this is an older picture, but it's showing the same information. This is actually looking at the security profile, which is the firewall. And basically these are incoming connections. So firewall, just like your ACLs, which is a firewall, the rules, have a direction as well. Incoming, outgoing. And we can also have a lockdown mode. When we enter this lockdown mode, we are basically disabling all of it and we only have basic access. Obviously, that's in the situation of intrusion. You go into lockdown mode. Control network access through the ESXi management interface. So we already discussed this. When we configure an ESXi server, we have multiple networks, we have to tell it which network to have a VM kernel port for management. Okay, we shouldn't put it on every network, should we? Like in this environment, for example, take, we've got the student network, we've got the server network, we've got the admin network, which is the staff network. Do you think we should put the management network on the student network? No, I know you guys are good students, but there's probably some bad students, right? That could be doing stuff. So if you don't want people on that network to be able to access the management, you should only allow it from the network you want management to happen. So in this case, maybe the server network, maybe not even the staff network, maybe the server network is all the one you want to allow, and only the ICT management can access the server network directly. Okay. Be sure to allow proper access to the vCenter server to the ESXi host. Obviously, in order for vCenter to manage the ESXi host, you must be able to communicate on the management network. So make sure the vCenter has interface to the management network you said you allow, so they can talk to each other. Don't forget to allow access from the VMA or from other systems on which you run the Power CLI scripts. So again, if we're using a computer to run scripts against our ESXi, they must be through the management network. Okay, so that's the things we have to allow. If the VMA or the Power command line scripts will be connecting to the vCenter server, then you just need to allow access to the vCenter server. Keeping anything patched. We all know that. Basic 101 principle of IT. Make sure you update your systems. Okay? It protects you from all the things that we know about. Okay?
Create new one.
It could create problems. Also, so number one rule.
It was always creating problems.
Number one rule is to update your things. Number two rule: don't be the first.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay, you heard of that one before. So number one rule is to make sure you're all updated, but don't be the first. Okay, so that's what I mean is if you're the first one to do it, you're the first one to experience all the problems. Yeah. Maybe wait. Update, but wait until it's been thoroughly tested by yourself or by someone else, and then they would fix it. Or you'll at least be able to find a fix for it if you do have problems.
Especially if it's about firmware.
Firmware, firmware. Yeah, that's less important than because it's very hard to get into the firmware remotely. So the firmware I'm not so worried about, but the operating system patches, the application patches, definitely. So like anything, the ESXi is software, it's code. If it's written by someone, then they probably made a mistake somewhere. They probably created some problems without knowing it. And basically all the bad guys, their job is to find all these problems so they can exploit it. And then it's almost cat and mouse. They find something, you realize they find something, you go fix it, and then you stop that problem. Okay? So basically you can, on an as-needed basis, release VMware release security patches. Failing to apply these security patches could expose your vSphere to potential risk. So we used to cover this topic in the past, a whole lesson on VUM. But in this subject, we don't have the time. So, but be aware that there is a VUM. So that's another server, okay? Another service. It's on vCenter. Okay, if you remember Roman and Son in Microsoft, what's that update server called? WSUS, right? What's this one? WSUS, Windows Security Update Server. Okay, and that used to download all the updates for our Microsoft applications and operating systems, so you don't have to go to the internet. You can test it, you can release it, and you can choose who you release it to or who you don't release it to. It's basically the same with VUM. VUM is vSphere Update Manager. It basically downloads all these patches for the vSphere infrastructure. And instead of you going to the internet and downloading individually, you download it and keep it local. And then you can actually create what's called these baselines, which means that you must have this or you must have this. You can have different baselines for different services, or different baselines applied to different hosts based on if you want to use some hosts as testing, other hosts as production, then you can actually release them as part of these baselines, similar to what we talked about with the WSUS just then. But it's for VMware products. Let's talk about permissions now, okay? So this is, again, ESXi host permissions. So we can assign permissions by creating groups or roles and then giving them specific permissions on the ESXi resource. So vCenter Server and ESXi share a common security model for access control. The items that are used differ between non-vCenter environments and vCenter environments, predominantly for the following: the location of the user and groups created, the level of granularity and of the roles and privileges available to each environment. So granularity is a strange word, isn't it? It's like how detailed can you set the permissions? That's what it means, okay? Fine grain, you might have heard that term, fine grain. That means it's like you're sifting sand, okay? That's where the word comes from. If you want coarse, you don't care about the individual grains, you just treat the whole pile of sand the same. There might be big pieces, small pieces, whatever. But if you want to make sure you have a smooth concrete, you might not want the big pieces. You might want only the small grains, right? So you might sift out the big ones. So that's what they're talking about. So if we do care about the finer details, like who can power the virtual machine on, who can change the CD media or DVD media or ISOs, who can open a console, these are getting fine, very, very fine grained things you can control, okay? So we have users or groups is an authentication mechanism. A group is a way of collecting users, so we all understand this is nothing new. All right. So privilege is the right or permission. Okay, a privilege is the action they can perform. This would include allocating space on the data store, power on a VM, configuring the network, attaching or changing the ISO image. So remember, these are things we can do to the VMs, to the virtualization environment, not inside the VMs, okay? The role is a combination of users and groups and a collection of privileges, and ESXi comes with some built-in roles. So they're pre-configured ones, so most of the time, what they've given you is good enough. But sometimes you want to create your specific fine-grained roles. So vSphere administrators can either use the built-in roles provided with ESXi or create some custom roles based on what you specifically want. All right, so here's some default roles, not many. No access, pretty obvious. They have no access. This prevents the access to an object. No access role can be used if the user was granted access. It's hierarchical. Again, there's inheritance. If I give something at a higher level, so you know that in the vSphere, we can see that there's different levels of things. We can click here, expand this, and go in more, right? So if we give something like at the right at the top at the data center level, then if we have hosts inside the data center, those same permissions flow to those objects if they apply, obviously. And then they flow to the VMs that's on those hosts. Then they flow to the virtual networking that's on those hosts and so forth. So if we have given them some access at the higher level, but we want to take away the access at a lower level, we have to use this no access at a lower level objects. Read only allows users to see the object within the vSphere client inventory. It does not allow the user to interact with any of the visible objects in any way. So they can just see what's there. They can't see the details, okay? And administrator, as you expect, that gives you all the rights. And we can create custom roles. So these are the built-in roles, free. Then we can create our custom ones. If we create a custom role, we can go in and we can look at these things like here in the virtual machine. We can go to interactions and what we can interact. See, we can power on. Oh, sorry, I'm using the wrong screen again. We can power on. We can power off. We can do
console interaction.
We can do lots of things, can't we? Yeah. And if we can keep on scrolling, we can even look at here the guest operations, and we can. You see how all these ticks are ticked? We can be very granular, and we can say that this user or this role could only power on this virtual machine. Just one thing, okay? So let's say we got a web server, and we got this this guy who just checks if the web server's on every day. He goes to work. Is the web server on? Have a look. Oh, it's not on. He gives him one right to turn it on, and that's all he can do. He can't change the network. He can't allocate more RAM. He can't change the media. But obviously, maybe his role on the virtualization doesn't need to do that. But maybe he's a web developer, but he can probably remote terminal or remote desktop into the web server and just work with the web server directly in the operating system. That's what he needs to do. As far as the virtualization environment, he just needs to be able to turn it on, so he doesn't interrupt your meeting every day to say, oh, the web server's off, can you turn it on? So you give him enough power to be able to do that particular job. You guys heard of the term principle of least privilege? Heard of that term? I'm sure you have. Roman has, Son has. I can guarantee you've heard me say it. Do you guys heard of that term? Yeah. What does it mean? It's a test, isn't it? Every lesson is a test, but every lesson, hopefully, I'm bringing you up to speed more and more.
Set it up to least necessarily level up. That's it.
Yeah, it's basically. So basically, we give people just enough permissions, rights, privileges to be able to do their job. Any more, even just one little thing more, they could potentially use it to do something bad. So we give them just enough to be able to do their job. Okay? So just because this guy who's a web developer, all he needs to do is turn on the web server. If we say turn off the power off as well, just because he can turn on, maybe we should give him power off. But he doesn't need to power off, really, does he? But what if he's upset with the company? He just goes, it powers off, right? So that could be cause a problem, right? So that's why principle of least privilege means just give them just enough to be able to get the job done. So granting permissions, roles do not work until the user or group is assigned to the role, and then the role basically passes on to the user or group, and they can do it. All right, so e.g., example, a group needs to work with all VMs that are web servers, just like what I just said before, the web developers. If access control is managed for the ESXi host, then you have to create a user account on that host together with a new group. This option would work like inheritance settings in a Windows file system. So it allows privileges assigned to be applied to objects beneath it. So if you give it to something higher level, it flows down to the lower levels. This simplifies access control implementation. So we all know that, hopefully, because if we have lots and lots of objects, I don't want to go each one and give the same permission, each one again and again and again and again. So if I just go to the highest level that they need access to, and we give it there, then it flows down to everything below it. Okay, so we could have what's called a virtual machine group, and we could actually give the permissions we need to that virtual machine group, and they will get it to all these virtual machines. Okay. What about logging? Remember we talked about logs, and Lexi was thinking of ways of deleting the logs. The system logs provide a record for all accounting of the actions performed and events encountered and the errors experienced. So all sorts of logs. ESXi run. So don't forget ESXi underneath all that is a sort of a Linux variant. Okay. So ESXi logs runs a syslog daemon. Have you heard of that term before? Daemon? Son, have you heard of that before?
So last lesson, I think.
Last lesson, LXN?
He had a friend named Damon.
Damon, he had a friend. Okay, that is a name, but basically it means the same thing as we know in Windows service. Okay, Linux, they call it daemons or daemons, and in Windows, we call it services. It means the same thing. Okay, they might call it, for example, the web server on Linux, it's called Apache, right? But the service that's running on it, it's called HTTPD, isn't it? HTTPD. Have you guys worked with Apache? Apache and Linux, the LXN? You've done that? So do you use do you look the service and you look up what HTTPD? Yeah, you heard of HTTPD? You might even go to a config file called httpd.conf, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. The D stands for daemon. Okay, so basically in Linux, it's called daemons. In Windows, it's called a service. That means the same thing. It's just Linux people and Windows people can't agree on what they call things, okay? Linux people always want to be cooler, so they call it a daemon. Windows people are nerds, obviously. Okay, the typical solution is to use a third-party syslog server. So a lot of people just use that. So you can just set up another Linux computer, configure a syslog server, and we can get the ESXi to send the logs to the syslog server. To make it easier, VMware applies a syslog collector on VMware 5 in 3 different forms. We can actually have an installable service that you can install on Windows-based computers, and we can, or as a service pre-installed as a VMware virtual appliance, or as part of a MA built-in syslog daemon. The syslog collector can be a standalone service, or you can install it as a vCenter integrator's instance, and that's what we're going to do today. If you install it as a vCenter integrator, you'll be able to view the ESXi host log settings from within the vSphere client. Some of the more common security recommendations include stay current with your Windows patches. Okay, so we all know that. Harden your Windows servers installation with the best practices. So you might have heard of that BPA. Heard of that before? Windows BPA. Let's see if we can find example. So basically, BPA stands for Best Practice Analyzer. We can actually download this Best Practice Analyzer. It will scan our server, and it will say, "Oh, what you've got, this is either good or this is not best practice," and it will recommend some steps you should do to harden your server. Okay, so what's best practice? Best practice is what Microsoft recommends as what you do. Okay, and usually I would be happy to go with what Microsoft recommends you to do. Okay, so stay current, use the best practices. In addition to these standard security and recommendations, some more specific ones for vCenter. Stay current with the vCenter patches and updates. Place the vCenter backend database on a separate system. So remember we talked about having database on a separate system or the same system. Obviously, if it's the same system, then if something fails, then it all fails. Best practice is to have a separate. If you are using Windows authentication with SQL Server, use a dedicated service account, okay, for vCenter. Secure the separate database server and the backend database server using published security practices from the appropriate vendor. So if it's Microsoft SQL, use the best practice from Microsoft. If it's Oracle, use their recommended practices. Replace the default vCenter self-signed certificate. You know, when you go to the website, you always go, warning, this is not a this is a self-signed certificate. You always have to click that. You can just go buy a certificate. Okay, go to VeriSign, go to GoDaddy. You get a third-party certificate. Okay, I'm sure Son and again, I keep on saying this, don't I? I keep on saying this because it's true. In our other subject, I can see that the TAFE SA has a HTTPS. So we're going to have the connection secured. Yeah, that's secured. Let's see if we can actually yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to view the certificate, but this is an Edge. I don't use this normally. Let's see if we can. I can't see where I can view this. Oh, here it is. Yeah, that's the one. So it's not. I'm not used to Edge. I hardly use it. This is a computer. Unfortunately, it's only got Edge on here. Okay, so you can see who is this from? This is from Amazon. We basically TAFE SA has gone to Amazon and say, can you verify we are legitimate? And Amazon has said, yes, you are legitimate. Here's a certificate to prove to everyone else in the universe that you're legitimate. So by having this, it's having someone else, a third party, obviously everyone knows Amazon in this case, say that he's okay. So for example, Reza, you're new to TAFE, aren't you, to this year? Did you know Alexi before? No, but if I'm your lecturer, and you know I'm your lecturer officially, and I say, oh, Alexi's a good guy, you can trust him. Yeah, if he tells you something, you can believe him. Will you be more likely to believe him or less likely?
You can give me something.
No, in that case, do not trust Alexi. Do not trust Alexi if he's going to do that. But basically, that's what it means, okay? With the trusted these certificates. But obviously, if you have a self-signed certificate, no one's going to trust you because I just gave it to myself. Okay, and that's why you got those warnings. Authenticate users against vCenter, so we can, if you deployed on as a Windows server, that's obviously for better. It's better preferred, but due to our resources, we've deployed it as a Linux-based virtual appliance. Yeah, so if you're deployed as a Windows-based server, generally this means you have Active Directory already. If you deployed it as a Linux-based appliance like we have, this option of using the NIS, which is a Network Information Service, or Active Directory, we can choose both. Just so you know, there's more than just Active Directory in the world. Okay, there's other directory services as well. LDAP is not a Microsoft protocol. It's a open protocol that lots of people can use. It just happens to be that Microsoft Active Directory is probably the most prominent one. When you're using vCenter server on a Windows server leveraging Active Directory, it's pretty simple. Join it to the Active Directory domain, and then you can start using the Active Directory. But for us, what we're going to do is we're going to actually go to the authentication source configuration part of our vCenter, and we're going to tell it to use Active Directory. Yep, so understanding the VPX user account. So this one I'm going to, VPX account and password are stored in the vCenter standard server database and on ESXi host. This is a special user account, and it's used to communicate from the vCenter's computer to a ESXi host. Okay, so when we put it into the vCenter, we're using this account in the background to control it. This VPX user password consists of a 32 random selected characters. It's encrypted with SHA-1 on ESXi host, and it's obfuscated on vCenter. What if you've never heard of this term, obfuscated? That's it's hidden. Basically, that's what it means. Each VPX user password is unique to the host, ESXi host being managed. No direct administrator intervention is warranted or advised for this account. We don't need it. Basically, don't worry about it. We just know that that's what we use. We're not going to change the password. We're not going to do anything with it. Just leave it. So we're managing vCenter. Again, we've got the no access. We've got the read only, and we've got the administrator, which we talked about before anyway. But there's also many other sample roles you can give. So if we want to use, so these are the default free roles, but there's many other sample roles as well. So we can also, so some of the privileges we can actually give include setting alarms, controls the ability to create, modify, delete, disable, acknowledge vCenter alarms. So there's things that come up. Auto deploy, I'm not going to go through all the list, but if you want to read it, these are all the things we can sort of control, plus more. Plus, okay, so there's quite a few things. And the ones we'll probably focus on the most is what's in the virtual machines, because that's the easiest to understand in our examples. But just know that we can control aspects, give permissions, give privileges to all of these aspects. Here's the server logs. Okay, so it's very it's just an example. I don't need to pick anything specific out, but this is the type of logs we're talking about. That gets logged every time you do something, you perform action, it gets logged. Okay, that's for the auditing authentic as part of the AAA security model. Securing virtual machines. So again, what about the virtual machines? We can configure network security policies. So if you remember in our assignment, we talked about some of these security policies. In our topic on the networking, we talked about promiscuous mode, changing MAC address changes, allowing forged transmits. VMware recommends keeping all of these policies as set to reject. So don't allow these things. But we can change it, but they recommend not to. If there's a valid business need for doing any of this, you can allow it. You can use purport group settings to enable the appropriate feature only on the specific VM. So maybe I've got a monitoring VM. Okay, maybe this monitoring VM will I should allow the port to be in promiscuous mode, so it can collect information from all the other ports I've got. Keeping the virtual machine patched. So again, this is pretty obvious. So that's inside the virtual machine now, the guest operating system. Keep that patched, keep that updated, and any applications it's got as well. All right, so where we're oh my God, we're a bit too far in as far as we took a little bit more time, but we did go through the assessments. So that's the presentation today, and I will say keep on working on your worksheets. There's a new one here today, and with this one, it's fairly straightforward. I don't think this one's hard at all, because a lot of you would have had background in just giving permissions, using groups, using user accounts, and basically we've got our setup, and we go through and we enable SSH like we talked about. Then we can test it. We review the firewall. We see what's open, and we restrict it to certain one. Then we edit the security profile, which is the firewall. We create Active Directory users and accounts. We create some groups. This GG, if you're not familiar with what we do here at TAFE, the GG stands for global groups. Okay, it's part of the naming convention, because we want to make sure that everyone knows when we look at a group, that's a global group. Okay, it's not a domain local group, it's not a universal group, it's a global group in this case. Then we're setting the vSphere authentication source to the Active Directory and using the single sign-on. And then this is basically setting the authentication provider, obviously using a password for the Active Directory, a bit like joining the domain. And then we actually changing the what's this one? Yeah, changing the password, is it? No, allowing the console. Okay, and just restarting the server. And then so this is the identity source. Then we log on instead of the vSphere.local, we use the Active Directory accounts. And then we can use other accounts as well. We can give permissions, and we assign roles, add permissions. I think it's fairly straightforward after you get happening. Okay, so we'll work on that.